I'm delighted to report that I have joined as a scholar the Declaration of Independence Center for the Study of American Freedom at the University of Mississippi. The center offers educational opportunities, speakers, internship, and reading groups for the University of Mississippi community. It is named in honor of the United States founding document, which constitutes the nation as a political community and expresses fundamental principles of American freedom, including in the recognition of the importance of Judeo-Christian values in shaping American exceptionalism. Dedicated to the academic and open-minded exploration of these principles, the center exists to encourage exploration into the many facets of freedom. It will sponsor a speaker series and an interdisciplinary faculty research team. If you'd like to learn more about the center, please visit OleMiss, that's OLEMISS.edu/independence/. Hi, everybody. This is Gad Saad. After a couple of weeks of break, because I was away in Israel, I'm back with another fantastic guest, Professor Jesse Bering. How you doing, sir?
Good. How are you, Gad? Good to see you.
Likewise. So I wanted to just read very briefly a very small portion of your bio, and then the
Sure.
book that your latest book, which is coming out in April, I believe. So you are a science writer. You are a research psychologist, professor of psychology at University of Otago, and head of the science communication program at that university. You are the author of The Belief Instinct. Why is the penis shaped like that? And other reflections on being human nature. We could certainly talk about that. Perv and Suicidal. And your latest book, coming out soon. Please go out there and pre-order it. The Incredible Afterlives of Dr. Stevenson, one scientist's epic quest for evidence of reincarnation, apparitions, poltergeists, and other matters of the soul. Wow, that's a mouthful. Let's
That's
start
amazing.
there. How do you decide, like, how does this guy come into your radar that you say, you know what, I'm going to spend the next 12, 14, 18 months writing
Mm.
about him? Take it away.
Well, I mean, I my own research program is on the psychology of afterlife beliefs. My earliest research as a PhD student was looking at how children think about the mind after death. So, for my dissertation, for instance, I had a little puppet show, and in that show, a mouse character died, and we asked children of different ages um, whether the character could have a variety of different types of psychological states. So, thinking, smelling, tasting, loving, all these types of psychological capacities.
But by the way, before you go on, your doctoral supervisor is a very well-known evolutionary-based developmental psychologist, David Bjorklund, correct?
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, take
Yeah.
it away.
So,
Continue.
well, I mean, my earliest research was on children's reasoning about the afterlife. And the most shocking thing, really, was that the younger the child, the more likely they were to say that mental states survived biological death, which went against the grain of common sense and what people sort of understood about afterlife beliefs, because people just assumed that we learn about the afterlife through religious indoctrination and so on. But in fact, it seemed to be that there's an innate basis to the idea that the mind survives death. I've been sort of operating on the assumption as a scientist for many years that this is all explicable through psychological processes. These are cognitive biases that it was just kind of a non-starter to me that when you die, that's it. The brain stops working. Therefore, any psychological states that are dependent on the brain stop as well. And I spent many years writing about the afterlife through the lens of that materialist assumption that um, that when you're dead, that's it. And I should say, I still sort of lean in that direction. But over the years, I came across some theoretical work, including the writings of Dr. Ian Stevenson, who got me thinking, I guess, a little bit more deeply about the possibility, perhaps, that um, that there's something a little bit more complicated about um, life and death.
Did you know of him early on in your doctoral work, or is this something that,
No,
recently you came across, said, okay, let me drill down this guy?
he wasn't on my radar at all until about 2012, 2013, when I wrote an article for Scientific American about his research program. And um, that sort of precipitated me going deeper into his line of thinking and his work. And it was, me approaching this from the perspective of a skeptical psychological scientist who believes that the afterlife can be explained through cognitive biases, innate predispositions, um, social cognition, and coming, face to face with these arguments from a parapsychological perspective, which is quite different, where he's saying that I'm aware of all of these things that you're talking about, but still, look, there is evidence that lends itself, at least to the interpretation, that the survival of consciousness after death is possible. So, me writing this book was kind of trying to reconcile these discrepant views. Me as a scientist, a materialistic, sort of hard-nosed empiricist, and the parapsychological perspective, where he's at least arguing that there is evidence that the mind survives death.
If you started, I don't know, I don't want to put a number in your mouth, but if you started at a skeptical level of zero belief in this stuff, subsequent to, you know, understanding his own research and writing this book, what's the number? Zero is not at all. 100, you're fully convinced. What's your number?
Well, I started at -0 for sure.
Okay.
It wasn't even a question that I was willing to indulge. It just seemed strange to me and patently obvious that um, when there's no neurological activity and the brain's dead, then mental states cease. What was more puzzling to me for all these years was the fact that people, the majority of people, um, seem to ignore the importance of the brain in generating psychological states and are simply willing to say that when you're dead, you still have these abilities. After writing the book, I would say I'm at least on the positive side of the scale.
But that could be a one.
It could be a one. I mean, I think my task in this book, at least as I saw it, was not to convince anybody, but to present as strong a case based on his evidence, Ian Stevenson's evidence, as possible, and let the reader come to their own conclusion. But I would say that I'm not quite as ardent a disbeliever as I was, and at least I'm willing to entertain the possibility that I've been wrong this whole time.
Well, so a couple of, as I was kind of reading very quickly through some of the biographical details of Stevenson's life, as often happens with this, serendipitous life that we live, couple
Mhm.
of connections to yours truly. Number one, he's born in Montreal.
Yeah,
I've been in Montreal since 1975. He was associated to McGill and I think
got
subsequently
his medical
bequeathed,
degree at McGill. Yeah,
right? And then bequeathed some stuff to, the history of
yeah, he
socials.
did.
Go ahead.
He left a significant amount of his will to McGill. Yes, just
Exactly.
his
And
endowed chair. Yeah,
I did an undergrad and an MBA at McGill. And thirdly, he spent a bit of time at Cornell. I,
correct. Yeah.
I did my MS and PhD at Cornell. And fourthly, you're not going to necessarily be able to predict this. Only a few days ago, and a very rare occurrence, I purchased a fiction book. Usually I'm a very avid reader, but
Uh-huh.
99%, maybe not 99%, but very, very high percent nonfiction. I bought this beauty, first edition, 1955. Now, I say maybe the French pronunciation Aldous Huxley, but apparently I was corrected. It's Aldous Huxley.
Mm.
And tell us the link between Aldous Huxley and your guy in that book.
So just to back up a little bit, so Ian Stevenson was one of the reasons that he appealed to me was that he was not your traditional sort of stereotypical believer in the paranormal. he was a very respected psychiatrist, a medical professional.
Sorry, that could go either way. That could either demonstrate that you've got scientific credentials
Sure.
or you're a perfect bullshitter because you are a psychiatrist. So I'm not
Well,
sure.
yeah. I mean, he would be cognizant of those discrepancies as well. But he was the so he like you said, he got his medical degree from McGill, and developed a really strong reputation basically as a psychiatric interviewer. So he wrote textbooks on psychiatric interviewing techniques. His specialization before he got into parapsychology and all this paranormal business was psychosomatic medicine. So he was interested in how emotional states induce physical changes. So, he was part of these groundbreaking studies back in the 40s and 50s where, you would get a patient or a participant to think about a distressing situation in their life. So, a cheating spouse or money problems or, whatever else is going on in their lives. And he would actually see how these negative emotional states would affect their physical organs. So he could actually tell that like the colon would change colors or texture, just simply because of these really potent emotional ruminative states. So that's important for his belief in reincarnation. We'll get back to that in a moment. But from there, he became an expert in these interviewing techniques with psychiatric patients. And he wrote these books about sort of proper ways to handle people with mental illness and psychiatric conditions in the examining room and how to kind of navigate the conversation with them to get the information that he needed. So he was, um, a prominent psychiatric figure. By the time he was 38, 39, he was the head of the neurology and psychiatry department at the University of Virginia, which is a good school. And he's still doing his sort of mainstream conventional work in that area. And he only kind of shifted to the paranormal research. I think what kind of led him in that direction was, and this is where Aldous Huxley comes back into it, because he was one of the first investigators to study psychedelics.
Right.
So
Yes.
this was before Timothy Leary, all of that stuff. He was really a leading figure in that field where he was trying to interview people who had taken mescaline or LSD and trying to get a sense of phenomenologically, what it was like to be in the head of somebody experiencing these altered states. And he did cross paths with Aldous Huxley. He was very much influenced by Huxley's book, Doors of Perception, which is an incredible read, a short but incredible read. But he wanted to empiricize it. He wanted to kind of discipline the discipline of psychedelic research. Anyway, through all of this, he began to kind of question the relationship between mind and body because on these trips, because he used himself as a subject in some of the psychedelic research, and on these trips, he thought he had some recollections of a previous life, and that motivated him to begin to take seriously the possibility that maybe um, there is a scientific way to approach these paranormal questions.
Got you. Now, if there are two things that one can do, I mean, there are maybe more than two, but you can just identify the occurrence of paranormal phenomena. And I did a quick search, and this is not like a pejorative recrimination, but I checked your book for Daryl Bem only
Oh
because
yeah, yeah, yeah.
only because he was a very mainstream, highly respected
Very
research psych
similar. Yeah, yeah,
research psychologist from my university at Cornell, who
absolutely. Yeah,
then did the whole ESP. But now some people have looked at it again and said, "Oops, it looks like it was a pure, big, moist pile of bullshit." Uh,
yeah,
so, number one, we can identify occurrences, and then we can debate whether they're genuine occurrences or not. But then number two is what is the mechanism by which these things happen? Was he
right.
largely focused on the documentation, the former, or did he tackle both levels of analyses, if we can say.
Well, I would say definitely the former. He had some sort of speculative ideas about mechanisms, but he invested most of his energy in terms of researching the phenomena itself to try to document the occurrence of these cases. So, and one of the differences between his approach, for instance, and Daryl Bem was that he thought that will get most traction in terms of research from what he called spontaneous cases, not experimental laboratory derived experimentation about these anomalous phenomena, because he thought that they were largely driven by strong emotions. They were unpredictable. They couldn't be simply conjured up in a laboratory setting because it didn't replicate naturalistic conditions where these phenomena would typically occur. And that's antithetical, of course, to what you and I do in terms of
Yeah.
controlled laboratory methods and replication, the importance of replication. But the to me, the most convincing evidence probably is with the spontaneous cases. If you trust I guess the veracity of his investigations themselves.
Interesting. What percent, I don't know if that data exists, but what percentage of surveyed, I mean, we can just restrict it to psychologists or more generally, academics. What percentage do we think or know are open to believing that such phenomena are possible?
Um, I don't have the current statistics, but I do remember quite a while ago that it was quite low, and there were disciplinary differences.
Is
So
that okay?
yeah,
Let me see if I can predict what's up. So disciplinary would be at the level of social sciences versus natural sciences, or is it
correct. Yeah,
just at that level? Not we're
yeah.
not going more granular.
No, we're talking sort of humanities versus hard sciences, I guess.
Okay, so
Or
humanities are more likely to believe in it than hard sciences.
yes, I mean I think that was demonstrated. Yeah.
Okay, but is it in the order of 1% believe it, or is it 22% believe it?
I don't know the figures offhand, but it was quite low in terms of people with hard science advanced degrees. I guess
Right.
I'll put it that way.
But just because they'd be so much more predisposed to being sort of having a materialist ethos. Is that the general idea?
Correct, yeah. So yeah, so I guess the fundamental distinction in these conversations are, boils down to traditional mainstream, what Ian Stevenson would call orthodox scientists who believe in the sort of materialist view that the brain generates consciousness, causes psychological states, versus those that are more open to the possibility that there's some type of dualism, that perhaps the brain is a sieve or a filter for some consciousness that's out there. So the brain isn't actually causing or generating or producing consciousness. It's simply the lens through which consciousness is expressed.
Is there, beyond the disciplinary breakdown that we just mentioned, are there other predictors of how likely I am to be a believer in paranormal? So let me think of a few off the top of my head. Does my religiosity score affect the likelihood of my believing in paranormal? And my a priori hypothesis would be more religious, more belief in paranormal. Is that right?
That's correct. And I mean, really, if you think about religious believers, I mean, they believe in the supernatural. They might not like to sort of consider themselves to be believers in paranormal or supernatural phenomena, but I mean, if you get into the weeds in terms of their actual epistemology, it is paranormal.
Right.
So we kind of quarantine religion as this sort of sacred space that we can't dig into more deeply about the sort of falsifiability or empirical nature of their claims. But whether you believe that um, you know Bigfoot is real, or your dead grandmother is in heaven watching you, categorically they're not that different in terms of explanatory value.
How about personality traits? For example,
Um,
so the one I was going to think about, I was going to propose, but then I could think of it going in opposite directions if there's a hypothesis. open-mindedness at first could seem as though, well, the more open-minded I am, the more I am open to the possibility of believing that there's something beyond it. But but for example, I'm extremely open-minded, I think, but yet I am so wedded to a materialist perspective that then that shuts down the possibility of my open-mindedness being open to the Stevenson stuff. Does that make sense?
Um, yeah, I think so. I mean, there have definitely been studies on individual differences and psychological and personality traits and likelihood of subscribing to paranormal or supernatural beliefs, and um, the big five traits, for instance, and openness to experience would certainly be one of those. Um, and that's, one of the reasons I think that I struggled so much to even read Ian Stevenson's cases. I think, you've got to somehow allow yourself the intellectual license to even explore or indulge in this literature to judge it adequately. And that's what I did in this book.
Have there been other biographies written on him, or is this the inaugural one?
No, surprisingly not. And it was a very difficult book to write because he's got a very um, protected legacy, I guess. People are very defensive about his reputation. He's got this sort of cult following among believers in reincarnation and paranormal phenomena that he was the investigator who provided solid evidence of life after death, mostly in the form of these case studies of reincarnation, but other categories of evidence as well. And um, I had a hard time, for instance, interviewing some of his contemporaries because they saw me as a skeptic and didn't even want to open the door to have this conversation with me because I don't think that they trusted me to handle his story in the way that they wanted the narrative to be told.
And if they read it now, would they say that they were wrong and you were very fair to him?
I think that they should. I would hope so, because I think I was quite sympathetic to him as a figure. And I do have enormous respect for him as a scientific investigator and sort of rogue figure that went against the grain and fought against the majority. And not in any other way, but you've got a lot in common with him in that sense,
That's
because I
right.
think that he was willing to forge a path that was courageous and brave and something that his contemporaries, wouldn't give the time of day. And, um, his arguments, at least from a sort of philosophy of science perspective, about why we just simply assume that, there's no consciousness after death without actually digging any deeper, I think he was right. I think it is a genuine scientific question that deserves a scientific approach. And because parapsychology has been so sensationalized over the years and, has found itself sort of in the grips of the entertainment industry and, really is not highly regarded at all now. I think it's unfortunate because I think there are still a lot of questions
Right.
that could be approached from a scientific perspective, like he was trying to do.
I was going to say that one of the and by the way, thank you for the kind words in your earlier comparison. One of the reasons why I asked you, did you start at zero and then what was your eventual number, is that when I've been asked previously, actually by a psychiatrist, I was on a British show, and the host of the show is a psychiatrist, and at the end of the show, he asked me, in all your years, as a professor and as a behavioral scientist, what has been the singular phenomenon that has surprised you the most about the human condition? Which surprisingly is a question that I had never been asked before. So I had to really very quickly kind of think on my feet. And then my answer, and you'll see how it's related to my question to you about has your number moved? I said, well, the inability for people to change their opinions once it is anchored, irrespective of how much evidence that you show them. So for me, if nothing else, the fact that you were open to the possibility of having your number go from zero to a positive number is exactly the kind of epistemic humility that we should all hope to have as scientists. The second
Right.
very quick point, and then I'll cede the floor back to you, is so I said Daryl Bem, who's a well-respected
Yes.
academic who dabbled. The only other person that I could think off the top of my head that straddled both would be Susan Blackmore
Oh
of
yeah, yeah.
mimetic
Psychiatrist.
fame,
Yeah.
who also I think had literally a position as a parapsychologist in
He went
England.
in the opposite direction. Yes.
Right. So
Yeah.
are there other famous or infamous, typically psychologists, that we could think of that were able to straddle both sides of the
Yeah.
fence?
One of the figures that I read about in the book, a colleague of Ian Stevenson, who actually played a central role in his work, was Gardner Murphy, who was a well-known social experimental psychologist in the 1940s through 60s, I would say, who was not only the president of the American Psychological Association, but also the American Society of Psychical Research.
Oh, wow.
Um, so he saw no obvious sort of tension or contradiction between his belief. I mean, and he was like Ian Stevenson. I mean, parapsychology is a very broad, I guess, discipline, if you want to call it that, in terms of anomalous phenomena. But these people were primarily interested in the question, as am I, about whether the mind or consciousness survives biological death. Gardner Murphy was definitely primarily interested in that question. And he he thought that at some point we would have a sort of comprehensive understanding of these phenomena that would lead to a rapprochement between psychological science and parapsychology. But yeah, he walked in both of those worlds. And I think people either thought that either they either held that against him. They thought that, well, he can't possibly be that bright a mind if he actually believes in these phenomena. Or they thought that, well, maybe there's something to it if somebody's so prestigious and somebody who knows this much about our discipline is giving the time of day to this question.
Can one go to many well-reputed universities and get a PhD in parapsychology?
That's a good question. Um, they've definitely fallen to the
Right.
wayside. There was one in Edinburgh. Um, I don't know what degree offerings the University of Virginia have at the moment in terms of postgraduate or graduate research, but the parapsychology unit that Ian Stevenson founded is very much still at the University of Virginia. It's part of the medical school.
Wow.
Um, they don't necessarily like to regard themselves, I think, some of the staff there, as parapsychologists. They've kind of shifted their focus more toward the psychology of anomalous phenomena. So, for instance, they study near-death experiences, but they're looking more now at how those types of experiences changes the individual psychologically and
Right.
how they view the world than whether it was real or not.
Well, I as you're speaking both about psychiatry and about near-death experiences, I can't help but think that there used to be, if you remember in the 90s, this craze of repressed memories that
Yes.
the therapist would then elicit from you. It's latent, it's hidden, it's, oh, if you weren't sexually abused in this life, then it must have been when you were
Many
Napoleon
lives, many
Bonaparte many lives ago.
masters. Yes.
So I can see how there is a potential bridge from some therapeutic approaches within the mental health
Right.
profession. So is that exactly what happened? Was that his bridge in that he was in?
No.
No.
In fact, Ian Stevenson had a very strong aversion to past life regression therapy.
Ah, okay.
He thought it was fraudulent. He thought that these were therapists taking advantage of vulnerable patients because he believed that putting people into these hypnotic states would just sort of induce these dreamlike sequences that seemed very real and powerful and emotionally evocative to the patient, but in fact had no basis in reality, and it couldn't be investigated from a scientific perspective because it was typically somebody saying that I was a peasant in, 16th century Belgium, and there's no record of their existence, so you couldn't actually investigate the
Right.
case, try to find that person who lived. So he felt very strongly that these past life regression approaches were bullshit, and he was primarily focused instead on um, children's seemingly spontaneous recollections of previous lives and these sort of unbidden conversations that they would have at a very early age, 2 to 5 years old, for instance, where they're giving, names and descriptions of places and, describing the interior of a house and what they did for a living and, all these types of things. And then he would try to sort of interrogate the child separately from the family of the person that died, ideally before they had any contact, and see if they lined up. And sometimes he had autopsy records and medical reports that showed, how the person died, the previous personality, he called it, and whether it mapped onto what the child was saying. And I have to say there are a handful of cases that are hard to explain if
Right.
you take Ian Stevenson at his word. And I actually think he was a really meticulous, scrupulous, thoughtful, scientific investigator, and that's why I had trouble just simply explaining away some of these idiosyncratic cases. But
While
you have to get into his work to actually read the case studies to understand the convincingness of them.
and I want to come back to near-death experiences in a second, so it's filed in the back of my mind. But just to continue with the point you just raised, the ones where you thought were very compelling, that sort of had your ears perked up, were you able, you yourself, to rule out all of the cognitive biases that would otherwise perfectly explain that phenomenon? And before you go on, let me
Sure.
explain one such example, which probably for you will be, you'll know it, but maybe some of our listeners won't. So, for example, there's something in psychology of decision making called the cell A bias. I actually used this explanation when I was talking in one of my chats with Jordan Peterson, because he's a huge Jungian guy and he was all into this synchronicity, Jungian synchronicity. And then I
Mhm.
offered him this explanation and he just said, you know what? I think you got me. So let's see if we can have a
Sure.
similar success rate here. So the cell A bias basically is the following. When I say, every single time that I get into the shower, my phone rings. It's unbelievable, right? Well, the reality is that there are four possible states of the world. I can get into the shower or not get into the shower, and the phone can ring or the phone cannot ring. My brain only codes when I get into the shower and the phone rings. So that's cell A. So that's coded as an occurrence in my brain. Whereas the three other cells, by the very nature of that state, are not coded in my brain. Therefore, I have an overestimation of the number of cases where these two events happen.
Yeah.
So if we take that example or any one of a bunch of other well documented cognitive biases, could we, and I'm not trying to be, injurious to his legacy, but would we
Sure.
be able to quickly erase most
It's
of
not a
the.
hagiography, I should say. I mean, I definitely am critical with his work.
Right.
So I don't believe simply everything that he wrote and sort of
Sure.
argued. But there are individual cases. I mean, he had thousands and thousands of cases, not just of reincarnation, but apparitions and mediums and all these types of things. And within them is kind of this corpus of cases that I guess would strain credulity in terms of the skeptic's ability, if you take it at least at his word, which again I
Right.
do because I think he was a valid, sort of trustworthy, meticulous scholar, um, are hard to explain by these types of processes. And it's mostly because of the specificity of the information that, in these reincarnation cases, for instance, a young child would give not only, I died in a car accident, but, I died on this route in this town in this car that was this
Wow.
color, that I was in the car with this person, very specific details that um, I don't know how to explain, and that's where I ran into this sort of brick wall as a psychologist, and accounting for those studies.
Interesting. I
I mean,
mean,
I can't rule out the possibility that, it was all made up. Who knows? But
now I really want
knowing
to
what I
read the
do
book.
about his legacy and his background and his approach and his right, I read everything that this guy ever wrote over, 40 years of a career, and he was a respectable, serious scientific figure.
So, would you consider yourself the current leading scholar on Ian Stevenson?
I should be if I'm not. Um, and I think, there are people certainly that have invested a lot of time and energy in researching his cases and writing about him, but I think that, many people have been just kind of, I talk in the book about motivated reasoning, that people kind of have these talk about psychological biases. They want to see what they already believe and find confirmation of their beliefs going into it. I think I was far enough removed as a skeptic, but also not a sort of mean-spirited debunker or anything like that that was trying to take him down.
Right.
But I think I was far enough removed from him as an individual, as a person, but also the cases themselves to do them justice. Um, and you know, at the end, my publisher was saying, "Well, what's your conclusion here?" And um, I kind of hesitate. This is true for probably all of my books because most of my books, I kind of just want to take the reader for a ride with, some interesting studies and issues and, getting to think a little bit more deeply about complicated, uncomfortable material. But basically, I basically kind of, again, I want the reader to decide, here's the strength of the evidence, you decide. For me, I felt like I was on a journey with, Don Quixote or something that, it was kind of like this, all of his cases were so intricate and involved and complicated that you don't know exactly what you're seeing, you know, and that's where the motivated reasoning biases come into full effect because you can interpret them in terms of the survival of consciousness after death. But if you're a non-believer going in, you'll just assume that something must be wrong in his data collection or his research.
Right.
Um, so, like I said at the beginning, I left it thinking maybe I'm wrong. Maybe, all these years I've been operating on this false presumption that the brain stops working after death and therefore the mind stops working after death. Maybe it's a little bit more complicated than that. At least I'm now willing to entertain that possibility. And I think it is a genuine scientific question.
Right. I was just gonna say one more thing about this general topic, and then maybe we can get into a bit of evolutionary psychology. So as I said earlier, I read, I'm a voracious reader, largely of nonfiction, but and I've often read biographies, but recently, for whatever reason, I've been on this like orgiastic kick of only reading biographies. So I
Yeah.
recently read a biography on Leonardo da Vinci. I read a biography on Abraham Maslow. By the way, fantastic biography. I'm looking here. I just finished a biography on Francis Bacon. I just finished a biography on Cleopatra. So, from the perspective of a reader, I can see sort of the unique style of reading a biography versus some other book. From
Yeah.
your perspective as the author of these different genres, did you find that your writing style or discipline or process was different for this biography than some of the other books? And if so, how?
Yeah, I think I found myself stepping back a little bit more in this book and inserting fewer anecdotes and kind of my story. I mean, occasionally I'll kind of bring them in just to have a juxtaposition between cases that he was highlighting and experiences that I've had that I can't explain. But this was his story, and I wanted to do justice to it, so I wanted to give him the stage, basically. So it was backing off a bit, trying to be a little less intrusive in terms of my own theoretical scaffolding and argumentation, and letting him make the as clear an argument as he can make through my own words, I
Right.
guess. Like I said, he had hundreds of articles, many books, very involved, complicated cases. And for me, the trick was synthesizing this material in a way that somebody who'd never heard of Ian Stevenson has no idea who this guy is or what he, what his objective was, to tell the story clearly.
Right. It's interesting because earlier today I published my inaugural article on X on the
Nice.
platform, and I actually posted it just for subscribers so far, and then
Uh,
eventually I'll release it. And in that article, I was sort of using the fact that I have a forthcoming book coming out soon to then discuss my writing process and how I go about it. And at one point, I talk about that, it really, in my case, but I think in any author's case, it's part top down in that, you start off with a, you know, pretty accurate table of contents. And then you populate that table of contents as you go along. So that's the top down. But then there is a bottom up organic part whereby
yeah.
while doing my research on empathy and suicides, because my book is about suicidal empathy, I get into cross-cultural instantiations of suicide that I didn't necessarily a priori have a clear
Sure.
roadmap that I was going. And those are some of the most fun nuggets by definition because I wasn't prepared to go there. That's part of my discovery during the process
Yeah.
of writing this book. And so,
Yeah.
at an even more meta level, the fact that you probably decided to write this book is not something that 15 years ago I could have asked you, down the line, do you think
Oh,
you'll be
completely
right?
different. Yeah.
Exactly. And it
Yeah.
was the same thing for me, for example, for the happiness book. Where is it? It's this one. Uh, I, after Parasitic Mind, I would be lying to you if I said, oh, my next book was going to be on happiness. But what ended up happening is that many people would write to me, Jesse, and say, how is it that you deal with all of these very complicated, thorny, controversial
Yeah.
issues, but you always seem like you're joking around? There's a twinkle in your eyes. You're funny. You're satirical.
Mhm.
What's your secret, professor? What's your secret?
Uh,
I said, you know what? Let me take a shot at writing a book. So do you agree that part of our intellectual lives that makes it so enriching is that you get these organic bottom up stuff coming up?
yeah, I mean, the proposal for this book looked nothing like
There you
the
go.
end result. I was originally writing a book about, the illusion of the afterlife and how psychology can explain why people believe in such an outlandish thing. And over the course of this, I went deeper into the Ian Stevenson work, and I'm like, well, maybe I'm being a little presumptuous here. And that changed the complete direction
Wow.
of this book. But yeah, I mean, it was this book took me 2 years to write. I mean, I didn't have a lot of background in parapsychology, because I just never gave it the time of day. But so I had to become an expert in a literature that was relatively foreign to me. But the best way to learn about a topic is to write about it, I
Right.
think. And so that's what I did. And it was, as you probably can relate, that sort of immersive process of losing yourself in the writing,
It's unbelievable. I
going on
wrote
the
about that
story.
today.
It's therapeutic, it's taking you outside of your life. I mean, I felt like I developed a relationship with Ian Stevenson. Like I got to
Wow.
really know him. And that kind of added this sort of meta level to the afterlife question, because here I was like almost having conversations with him across time. I mean, he's been dead for almost 20 years now. And nevertheless, through these intimate correspondences, these letters that he wrote, his arguments, I felt like I was having a conversation with him. I loved it. Yeah.
Do you, once you finish a book and it's gone, do you ever, maybe I'm being too hyperbolic or maybe not. At least for my first book many years ago, much more so than now, but I still sort of get it. I get almost like a postpartum depression because I am so enthralled in the process of writing. Like I can't see right, I can't see left. I get
Yeah.
up, I go to the cafe, I open the laptop, and I'm gone for the next 8 hours.
Oh, I have dreams where I'm actually working on lines in the book,
Is
sort
that
of,
right?
yeah, editing lines and different words and that sort of thing.
So,
Yeah.
but then when that finishes, do you sort of wake up and you're like, what do I do with myself today? I mean, I don't have
Yeah,
that
I
immediate purpose and meaning.
I experienced that. usually there's another project. I need a
Yeah.
project in my life to work on. I mean, that's just simply my happy space is to find a project. And, I've got one that I'm trying to sort of segue into now that hopefully will, fill that need. But yeah, I mean, I did feel like I said everything I could possibly say about Ian Stevenson's work. And I felt like it was a very exhaustive process and there was not much else I could do
Right.
with it. I took it as far as I possibly could. So I felt like I came to the end of the road with it, but yeah, there's a bittersweet sort of feeling at the end of it.
So if you're for the people who don't know, I mean, you're trained as an evolutionary psychologist, very much, you know, within that paradigm. Todd Shackelford, also, who was at Florida Atlantic University. So there are many well-known evolutionary psychologists that you've dealt with. You've published papers in academic journals in evolutionary psychology. How do you compare your happiness or fulfillment level today
Yeah.
when publishing your next academic paper versus the book? And I don't mean to imply, it might seem as though it's a leading question where I'm asking you to say, I much rather write books now. So
Yeah.
whatever the answer is, it's fine. Take it away.
Um, I still yeah, I still like both.
Yeah,
I
me too.
think, one of the things that happened with writing this book about Ian Stevenson was that it kind of rebooted my interest in doing research on afterlife beliefs. So, as a consequence of this, I'm kind of returning to my roots. I mean, my earliest research was on the psychology of afterlife beliefs. And because of writing this popular book, I'm thinking more seriously about laboratory studies, proper investigations of the afterlife. Maybe not parapsychology, but maybe as well. Maybe I can add a bit of that in there too. So I think that there's like it's balancing both
Yeah.
worlds. Having a foot in maintaining a solid foot within your academic discipline and your area of training and specialization. Research that you're passionate about, but also you know trying to tell good stories and making an impact in the world. And so I would say it's balanced.
Right.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean, I would say it's also balanced for me, but it is increasingly tilting towards broader audiences because we live as I mean, we didn't need Thomas Sowell to tell us this, but we live in a world where there are trade-offs, where
Yeah.
there are opportunity costs, and
Yeah.
in an infinite resources world, I want to do everything perfectly, full throttle.
I
But
understand that. Yeah.
you're
Yeah.
right, but like, let me address the third round revision of some journal that I've been fighting with for 18 months, which, if that paper will be incredibly successful, I could hope to have it cited maybe 200 times.
Yeah.
Or let me write a book which is going to be translated into 25 languages and read by a million people. Well, and
Sure.
I'd
Yeah.
even enter money into the equation, just in terms of reach, right? We create knowledge and we disseminate knowledge, and my itch for dissemination is no longer being scratched when I get 72 citations in my next paper.
Yeah, no, I completely understand that. And I think that that's what motivated me to begin, writing for Scientific American and Slate, all these places because you get because you're passionate about the research itself and you
Yeah,
want to talk about
exactly.
interesting science and you want people to understand it and be engaged with it. And it's just kind of quarantined or lost within these echo chambers, these very small academic communities that, it never gets out of that space. Um, Interestingly enough, Ian Stevenson's work kind of spoke to that because he, like I said, he had this really strong aversion to his science being, I guess, bastardized or kind of, popularized in a way that, unscrupulous TV executives would see some story about paranormal phenomena and sort of want to make a big, hair-raising uh, movie or story about it. He thought it belonged to science and he wanted to talk just to scientists and people who would take the work seriously. So I think some of it has to do with the subject matter, I guess, if that
Yes.
makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, no, I get it.
Um,
What are some things that are exciting you. Let's geek out a bit on some of our own interests in evolutionary psychology research. What's some of the stuff that you're excited about from an evolutionary psychological perspective?
Well, I'm still writing about sex.
Yes.
I had a sort of detour in my career where I was writing quite a lot about human sexuality and evolutionary foundations of sex. So I've been writing this weekly column for La Plante and familiarizing myself with the literature, getting refamiliarized with the sort of ongoing research in evolutionary psychology, and there's still loads of fascinating stuff. My next piece is going to be about the tactics that people use when they're in relationships to detect infidelity, and also the counter tactics that people that are in some sort of extramarital relationship use
So
to
the,
hide
the old
their
evolutionary
infidelity.
arms race.
The arms race, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's some really fascinating work with interviewing people about their sort of everyday techniques for figuring out whether their partner is really cheating on them or not. Um, and I think so. I think I've got a taste for, and this might be kind of contradictory to what I said. I've got a taste for sort of sensational, sort of fascinating, attention-worthy topics in evolutionary psychology because that's what attracts people's attention and gets them thinking a little bit more deeply about the theoretical bases
Yeah.
of the field.
Do you does it frustrate you uh, the extent to which, never mind our academic colleagues who are still detractors of evolutionary psychology, but just everyday people, and certainly in social media, I never cease to be amazed by the extent to which people who know almost nothing about what I do are so convinced
Yeah.
that it's all quackery, charlotte. Yeah, right. I mean, we sit around with a martini, with a
It's
cigar.
parapsychology to them.
Yeah, exactly. And we just come up with bullshit, just so stories that have absolutely no basis. When, of course, the exact opposite epistemologically is true, right?
It's some of the
Before
most rigorous work
Exactly.
in the yeah.
Before you commit to the idea that something is an adaptation, the type of nomological network of cumulative evidence that you have to build to support the idea that that's an adaptation is astoundingly more rigorous than all of the other sciences. But apparently, I'm just a bullshitter who concocts, Kipling stories.
Sure, yeah. No, it's enormously frustrating. And it's usually, people who have a very thin, sort of superficial understanding of the discipline, and they've heard about evolutionary psychology in their gender studies or sociology coursework, and just have a very knee-jerk reaction to it, without understanding the main point about proximate and ultimate causation and separating those explanatory levels. So yeah.
Do you feel that it is an indelible part of the architecture of the human mind to always be resistant to evolutionary theorizing regarding human behavior? Or could we ever slay permanently that phoenix to never arise from the ashes again?
I think it has something, and this may have something to do with my longstanding interest in the afterlife, because I think a lot of it has to do with our fear of mortality
Right.
and what evolutionary explanations ultimately mean about human existence and our finite place in the world, our very ephemeral nature. And I think that's terrifying and frightening to people. And ultimately, those types of existential anxieties, to me, seem to be at the heart of a lot of people's aversion to evolutionary theory. We are animals, we are
Right.
biological organisms. I saw an old interview with Rodney Dangerfield, and he was on Howard Stern or something, and he was an old man at that time, and he was near death. And Howard Stern asked him basically if he believed in the afterlife, and he said, "Well, we're gorillas. Do gorillas come back from the dead? Is there an afterlife for gorillas?" And that's the sort of question that I've struggled with too. Like, why would just human beings have this kind of continuation of consciousness after death? What about a termite or a sandfly or our dogs or a gorilla, whatever? What does the afterlife look like for them? And yeah. So
I hear you.
I'm sorry
Uh,
that I went off on a bit of a tangent, but yes, I have that same frustration, I guess, with people
yeah.
who think they understand evolutionary psychology, but don't at all.
All right. Next question. And before I ask you about any other projects that you might be working on beyond the forthcoming book that you're so
Oh, I have one that you might be interested in, but yeah, sure.
so hold on.
Yeah.
So it may or may not go strictly to my exclusive subscribers. In my last book, in the happiness book, I have a chapter on the psychology of regret, where
Mhm.
I actually talk about work actually by one of my former professors at Cornell, Thomas Gilovich, who did
Yeah.
empirical studies of a lot. You're familiar with this stuff. So regret due to action, regret due to inaction, regret due to action. I regret that I cheated on my wife and now my marriage is over. Regret due to inaction. I regret that I became an accountant because my dad and his dad were accountants, but in reality, I wish that I would have become an architect because I'd always been interested in that. And I think you probably know, Jesse, that most people's biggest looming regret is one associated with inaction, that the road
Mhm.
that I did not take. So if I were to ask you now, you're still a relatively young man. If I were to say to
50.
you, 50, wow, there you go. If I were to say to you today, so
Yeah.
far, what might be your biggest looming regret? Could you share it with us? And will it coincide with what Thomas Gilovich told us about action versus inaction?
Yeah, for sure. For me, I mean, I've written extensively about the fact that I'm gay, and I didn't come out of the closet until relatively late. I was in my sort of early 20s when I came out to my mother. I sort of sublimated, I would say, my sexuality and really threw myself into academic research, and my romantic and sexual life sort of took a back seat to everything else. And I think I lost precious time from that. I mean, I've been with my partner now for 20 years, and I'm very grateful for that. But I think I got a bit of a late start uh, coming out as late as I did. But it was also, it was an artifact of growing up in a conservative town in the Midwest and, not knowing any gay people and having, these sort of stereotypic assumptions about what homosexuality was and all these types of things. And so I guess that would be my
So, but is
biggest
the
regret.
regret due to the fact that you carried that burden longer before it came out, or that you missed opportunities that other,
Both.
oh,
Yeah.
both.
I would
Okay.
say probably the latter, actually. Um, youth is, it's fleeting. And I feel like there were missed opportunities for sure in terms of sex and dating and romance and all those types of things. But also just that guilt and anxiety and shame and all these horrible feelings that sort of go along with coming out of the closet. It was complicated for me, because my mother was dying at the time. She was sick, and I didn't want to burden her with that, about me. But yeah, I guess if I had to say any sort of big regret, it would be not being more open and honest with myself and with others earlier.
Wow, what an amazing answer. All right, tell me about the project that you were so excited to tell me about.
Well, I I know who Solomon Asch is.
Yeah, of course. Come on, man.
So I mean his work that the famous line study where
I
unconformity
mean,
equals sort
I
of
eat, breathe, and sleep that study.
absolutely. I mean it's so simple but so profound, and it has always made an enormous impact on me because I think that it spoke so much about human social psychology and majority influence and conformity, all these types of things. Anyway, nobody's ever written his biography.
Oh my
And
God, sign me up, first reader of that book.
so last month, I went to the Museum of the History of Psychology at the University of Akron, of all places. That's where they have this incredible archive, this repository of,
University of Akron,
yes, yeah,
as in Ohio?
Correct.
I didn't
Yes.
think Ohio was a real place.
It's a arm of the Smithsonian. It's got this enormous collection. It's been around for a while, but it's quite I don't think it's on many people's radar. Anyway, the estate of Solomon Asch left all of his files and his letters and his records to this to this collection, this library. And I found his memoir, his autobiography, thousands of pages that he wrote that he never got around to finishing. And it talks about growing up as a boy in Poland. He didn't move to the U.S. till he was 13, didn't know a
Can
word of
I just
English.
remind you that he's Jewish?
Yeah, and he was influenced by the Holocaust for sure with those studies. So the memoir talks a lot about being Jewish and growing up in this village in Poland, moving to the US in 1920, this incredible story. And that's what I'm digging into next.
So hold on, just so I understand. First of all, my excitement level is at 100. So that number one.
Okay.
Number two, are you saying that you'd like to help in publishing his autobiography, or is it that you'd like to write a biography using access to his autobiography?
Both, I would say a little bit of both.
Okay.
But I'm also trying to make his work relevant to what's happening today, and looking at his famous studies and his sort of core ideas about conformity and influence through the lens of contemporary conversations. Um,
Well, I mean, it's
Probably using
almost
some pretty meaty.
impossible. Sorry to interrupt you. Forgive me.
Yeah,
It's almost impossible to think of a set of studies that are more relevant to everything
exactly.
more than
Yeah,
Solomon Asch.
for sure. Yeah.
So nobody's done this before?
No, there's a very slim volume that's kind of like a set of memorial essays to him with a very short autobiography that he wrote, but no proper treatment in terms of his life story. And he was a
Wow.
good guy. Like he was completely sane and sober and clear-headed and brilliant um, uh, but also had very deep humanitarian interest. He was, of course, Milgram's advisor, and just crossed paths with so much that was happening at the height of social psychology in the 1950s and 60s.
That's amazing. So I wonder if he would have crossed at all with Maslow, because, as I mentioned, the biography. Oh, by the way, the guy who wrote the biography on Maslow is still alive. I reached out to him, and you might imagine, I mean, he wrote this biography, I don't know, maybe in the 70s. And here's this guy who was borderline in diapers in the 1970s, not quite.
Yeah.
And I'm writing to him now. And so I'm hoping to get him on the
Oh,
show
that's cool. Yeah.
soon. So that should be really cool. So what's the timeline for this project?
Oh, I'm on sabbatical this year and, putting together the proposal. It's pretty early days.
Got you.
But I've got all the material. And the next step would be tracing his story, maybe talking to his grandchildren who are still alive and
Wow.
uh, maybe going to Poland to visit his hometown and seeing sort of where he grew up. But also, I mean, as you know, it's been decades since that work, and there have been thousands of studies,
Yeah.
iterations of the line studying conformity. So, going to be a pretty formidable project.
Oh my God, I'm so excited for you. I can't wait. Make sure to come back when the book comes out.
Oh yeah, yeah,
Make
yeah,
sure
for
to
sure.
send me a
I mean, I
copy.
knew it would speak to you because
Oh
I
my,
was.
like it almost, I mean, short of you telling me that you're meeting Leonardo da Vinci next week to discuss his work, that would be right up there. So
Yeah.
you're exactly right. Listen, it's what a pleasure it is to talk to you. I hope that we'll get a chance to see each other in person in New Zealand soon,
Oh yeah,
inshallah.
working on it for
I
sure. Yeah.
know you are. Thank you so much. Say hello to your colleague
Simon.
at
Yeah.
yes. He was a
I
lovely fellow.
will.
I met him at University of Buckingham, and come back anytime. Stay on the line so we could say goodbye offline.
Okay.
And again, let me just read the title of the book before you go. The Incredible Afterlives of Dr. Stevenson, coming out this April, University of Chicago Press. Go pre-order it right now, people. Thank you, Jesse.
Thank you. Yeah.